I bring greetings to you, Montgomery Church. My name is Chip Wright. I'm a retired clergy in the Baltimore Washington Conference, having served churches across the conference. In this area, I did serve at Newmarket and Mount Carmel churches and also at Trinity Church in Frederick. I'm here at this video, however, not because of that or because I ever served at Montgomery, but because I'm a part of this church through my family history. It was my great-grandfather, John A. Wright, who was appointed here in 1902. He was part of the Methodist Protestant Church, which was an earlier denomination that merged with other denominations to form the Methodist Church in 1939, and was a member of the Maryland Conference, which included the state of Delaware and all of Maryland. Most of his appointments and his family were from the Eastern Shore, but several times he did serve appointments here on the Western Shore of the Bay. He was the first of 4 generations of clergy in my family. Following him was my grandfather, William Francis Wright, then my father, Harold Bell Wright, and then me, who served for 40 years. When John and Annie moved here in 1902, they brought with them a family of 4 children, and 2 more were born while they were here. I obviously did not know him. He died way before I was born, but I do know some family history about him. He was raised in the Methodist Protestant Church, served a multiple number of churches in Maryland and Delaware, and from all that I can tell, these were some of his happiest and best years. He had a house full of kids. He built the building which was a part of your congregation that stands still at the corner of Route 80 and Route 27, which you moved from when you moved into your present facility. My grandfather was the oldest of their children. He was a teenager when he was here, and it was while they lived here that he met my grandmother, who was born and raised on Old Bartholow's Road. The home she was born and raised in still stands just off of Interstate 70. And together they would walk to school, and they fell in love, were members of the first graduating class of Newmarket High School. She was a part of the Rice and Wood families out of the Newmarket area. I distinctly remember that when they died, it was very clearly my grandfather's desire to be buried in the Montgomery Cemetery, so that he could be with all of his friends from high school. I grew up hearing and knowing some of their friends. The names of Day and Moxley and Warfield and Wood were familiar names in those family relationships and friendships that he maintained throughout his life. Other than that, I don't know a whole lot about ministry. He built a church here. He had kids here. The kids loved it here, and this was part of their home for 6 very happy years of ministry. They moved from Montgomery in 1908 and returned to Delmar, Delaware, where he finished his pastorate and retired from there and lived out his final years there in Delmar, where he is buried. His legacy is in this church and much of what has happened here and the buildings that were built while he was here, in the fact that two of his sons went into ministry, and the heritage that he gave to this church and to my family. One of the favorite and most precious pieces of furniture in my home is a antique grandfather mantel clock about this big that was the first thing that he and Annie bought when they were married. That clock was passed on to my grandfather and then to my father and now to me. And so a part of John A. lives in my home with me and in my heart, a man I never knew but whose heritage I carry. We found something he wrote in the family Bible about his time here. It says, "From Dorchester we were sent to the Kemptown charge. The first year we had Montgomery charge with F.M. Cliff assistant. Built Mount Lebanon Church first year, built Mount Montgomery Church, remodeled all the rest of the churches and parsonage, had splendid congregation at all the appointments, and left the charge in splendid shape with all debts paid off." That was a good writing. It was a good time for he and his family at this church. And I wish you all a very happy anniversary as you celebrate your heritage and your future.
In 1969, when I first came to Montgomery, I was told that everything was done that was supposed to be done as far as building this building. Unfortunately, nothing had been done. The only thing really that had been done was that the trustees had purchased this 11 acres up here on the hill instead of the 7 acres that was down across 27th from the old church. And they found out that the Park and Planning Commission was planning on putting a bypass around Damascus, and it was going to go through that property. So there was no way we could build on it. So the trustees purchased this piece of land, and there was some contention because people didn't really want to come up here on the hill away from the old church. But there was nothing else that could be done at the time. So the building committee decided it was time to get to work. So they hired an architect. Well, the first thing we had to do was prove to the conference that we wanted to build a building. So they said that we had to have a congregational meeting and vote on it. So we did, and all but 2 of the votes were positive, and 2 of the votes were negative, that they didn't want to build up here on the hill. So that was proof to the conference that we wanted to build a building. And so they gave us their approval, and then we started to work. We hired an architect who drew up the plans for the building and drew up a sketch so that we could see what it would look like. And the building committee looked at it, approved it, was satisfied with it, and so the next thing that we needed to do was to put it out on bids. So we put it out on bids, and Jesse Dustin and Sons out of Hagerstown was the low bidder. My memory doesn't serve me correct as far as the number of dollars that was involved, but it was quite a bit. So after that was done, we couldn't build until we had a loan from the bank. And the only way we could get a loan from the bank was to have pledges within the congregation that would equal or exceed the amount of money that that we wanted to have for the building. So the next thing we did was start a fundraising campaign. The conference sent us a man from the Board of Missions who came out and helped us plan our 2-week funding drive, and so we could get pledges and have enough money to cover the expense of the building. So let's see, the next thing we did was we counted up the pledges, and they equaled what we needed to build the building, plus several $1,000s more. So we knew we were in good shape. So it was time to start building. And so the building committee decided that Jesse Dustin would be our builder. And Zimmerman, I think, was the name of the architect. He was the architect. And it was time for us to begin the building. The building was begun, and in 1971, I think, 1970, 71, something like that, and it took about 8 months, 10 months for it to be built. The congregation was very excited to get a social hall and to get a kitchen where they could have their suppers. And we had a kitchen committee. They went out and purchased the items that we needed for the kitchen, the deep fryers and a dishwasher and all the other things that go into a kitchen, make it a regular commercial kitchen that the Board of Health would approve. It was amazing the number of approvals we had to have, because everything that we did, we had to be approved by the county. And so consequently, we were fighting with the county the entire time that we were up here on the hill trying to build our building. The building was completed, I think, in 1971, and we started worshiping up here shortly after the fire in the old building. There was a fire one night in the basement of the old building, and it burned out the basement completely. And we couldn't worship down there anymore, so we came up here and worshiped in the social hall. I was amazed at the number of people that came out because of those who didn't want to come up here on the hill. And yet when we started worshiping up here, the place filled up. And it was fun. It was enjoyment. And although we missed the old building, the quaintness of it, we still enjoyed worshiping in the new social hall. One other thing with the county, we had to have an occupancy permit, and we had a dinner planned for the Lions Club. Well, we couldn't have the dinner if we didn't have an occupancy permit. So I went down to the county. I think the dinner was on a Friday night, and I went down to the county on Friday afternoon to get the occupancy permit, and they wouldn't let me have it. And I said, why not? Well, you haven't passed this and you haven't passed that. And I said, oh, yes, we have. And they said, well, prove it to us. And I said, well, how do you want me to prove it to you? And they said, well, let's look in the record and see. So they looked in the record, and this took the better part of an afternoon, of the Friday afternoon that we were supposed to have the dinner Friday night. And so finally, they agreed that we had met all of the inspections that we needed and everything else, and so they would issue us an occupancy permit. So they did, and I came back up here about 5 o'clock with the occupancy permit in my hand, and the dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock. So we just made it. Other than that, I don't know what we would have done. But it was something. It was quite an experience. I've often said that the next church that I go to, I'm only going to know where there's one light switch, and that's to my office. Because I know where every light switch, I know where every breakers. I know where everything is in this building because it was my life for about 8 or 10 months while we built. And that's it.
Hi, my name is Susan Gessling Summers, and I was a member here at Montgomery United Methodist when the pastor, Reverend Galen R. Minnie, was here from 1976 until 1981. I am reading from what he shared with us today. The new pastor arriving at Montgomery Church in July of 1976 was the Reverend Galen R. Minnie, along with his wife Carolyn and their children Michelle and Jeremy. They were with us until June of 1981. In those years, a lot of creative activities took place. There had been a fire at the old church, and the congregational leaders had to decide what direction they wanted to proceed, either fix up the old church or move to the sanctuary on the new building location. The MYF had a float in Damascus parade with the theme apple butter making. It helped promote the Montgomery Church was known near and far for its apple butter. They did this event every fall. Another fundraiser at Montgomery Church in those days was the oyster dinner. Joyce Rhodes wrote the names of each oyster patter so we knew how many hands were needed. We still have a copy of that letter. Carolyn was the gopher, Mr. Russell had a big crock and paddle making his iced tea, and Galen and Mr. Raymond stood by the back door of the kitchen and talked about the good old days. Halloween parties took place during these years, and in one of those, Carolyn remembers being dressed like a corn shock. Everyone present was startled when the corn shock was more than a decoration and began to move around. Prior to Christmas, we had a children's bazaar. Children would come by and buy Christmas gifts for their family members. Many of the items were wooden crafts that were made in Carrie Kelpie's wood shop by the men of the church. At the bazaar, the ladies would wrap the purchased gifts for the children. One Christmas, the Sunday school had a pageant called Journey to Bethlehem. Each classroom was set up to tell the story of Christ's birth, as the participants walked from one room to the next. There was a pottery shop, a wood shop where the mangers were being built, a hillside where the shepherds were keeping watch over their sheep, a tax collector, an innkeeper, and the stable where Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus were. One of the groups that was very active on a weekly basis was the PSA group. It stood for Prayer, Study, and Action. Galen and Carolyn were regular attendees at these meetings. The action part of the group was to be in service. Among their generous missions were to give fruit baskets to the shut-ins and make regular visits with cakes and favors to the Sykesville Hospital. A group organized in 1979 became known as the Heritage Circle. It was a time for fellowship and caring for each other during their senior years. One of their activities was making a quilt in 1979 as a surprise gift for Carolyn. Now it is one of their most cherished gifts. Another circle that was started during these years was known as the Friendship Circle. It was organized as a fellowship for support for the young mothers. Other events during that time were a Galilean service that took place on Peggy and Carrie Kelpie's pond. This worship service was in the evening. Galen, as pastor, was in a boat on the pond, and those attending were instructed to light a candle and float it on the water. They also compiled a church cookbook during this time, and it was dedicated to Esther Klein. The 50-50 Club members enjoyed times of fellowship throughout the year, and we participated in Easter sunrise services at Sugarloaf Mountain. Young families went on camping trips in the summer, and the church would have a picnic every August. The Browningsville Band would come and play, there would be a cakewalk, and Albert Warfield would sell his watermelons. MYF would have softball games in the front yard of the church, and a new program for youth that took place was to be part of the Appalachian Service Project. For several summers, we sent youth teams to Kentucky and Tennessee to repair homes for the needy. Often we had 2 vehicles making the trip, along with Galen and Carolyn, another adult team, and 12 youth. The experience was life-changing. The youth would have fundraisers during the year to make the trip possible. They made hot cross buns, in Jim and Thelma Gessling's kitchen and sold them. At the August picnic, they made and sold homemade ice cream. A time and talent auction was also a fundraiser. At the auction, the youth would offer services like babysitting and yard work. Food was also sold along with special trips. Team building and learning carpentry skills were to take place prior to the trip to Appalachia. So one of the things in the handbook was how to build an outhouse. We gathered the wood, the nails, etc., and built an outhouse at the parsonage. Little did we know that it would cause such a stir days later. It so happened that some of the adults from the church moved the outhouse to the front of the parsonage and placed a dummy inside of it and a spotlight on it. Next to it, they put a sign that read, "Preacher's Privy." The outhouse remained there a short time, but it sure caught the eye of many driving by. Outdoor worship in a chapel behind the church began during this period. It was given in memory of Jim Gessling by his wife Thelma and her children. Montgomery Church was then able to worship in the beautiful woods in the summer months. Montgomery Church continues to move forward, but sometimes it's good to take a look back. I'm glad that I could contribute in the years when I served as your pastor. Let me say happy anniversary to all of you who are present at the present time make up the body of Christ. There are always new opportunities to come to know God, to worship together, to join in fellowship, and to be in service to God and neighbor. In all of this, may God's name be praised, and may you be fully alive. That's sent to you from Reverend Galen R. Minnie. Thank you.
It was 1981. I was 30, going on 31, and that was the beginning of my ministry here at Montgomery Church. I remember driving up 27 with my family, actually my oldest son and an infant son, my middle son, and we were driving, coming off 270, and finally got to Damascus, and I thought, well, we are definitely in rural space, except there was a McDonald's there, so I thought, well, there must be some civilization here. But we enjoyed 14 years of ministry here at Montgomery Church and much growth. The community actually changed significantly during those 14 years. It was very rural in its origins, and it was becoming suburban, so I often called it ruburban. And we came into the ministry. There were about 75 or so people in worship, and we began to grow and grew rather rapidly after about a year or so. Had a lot of new people coming to the community and joining the church. Many of them were very experienced in leadership in other churches, and that helped us to grow rather quickly. There was always some challenges because of the transitions from rural to more suburban, and there had been some conflict, honestly, in the congregation before I came, and so the first years were a little unsettling for everyone, and I was the youngest pastor that they had had in a long time, so some adjustments, but we had many good years. During the time we were here, the Sunday school grew. There were plans when I came to build a sanctuary, and we didn't do that right away. There was other things that needed attention and were a higher priority, but in 1991 we were able to build a sanctuary, which had been a dream of the congregation for a long period of time. And we enjoyed that for 4 more years before I was moved to Faith United Methodist Church in Rockville. Some of the highlights for me, there were some wonderful people here, some saints of God that deeply affected my life, helped me to become more mature, and it's always difficult to mention one or another, but I'll always remember Malloy Moxley. He was very much a spiritual mentor for me and a person who provided a lot of stability for me. There were many others that just graced our lives. And I would say that the highlights of our ministry, I tend to be more of a preacher who preaches through books of the Bible, not a lectionary preacher. And we covered a lot of scriptures. I hoped that I helped people to grow in their love of God and their ability to read and understand and interpret scripture. And we had many small groups that grew. My wife led one for women, and I did one for men on Tuesday evenings for a long time, and then others grew out of that. We were very involved in missions during that time. Helen Mihalis was very instrumental in helping us to launch Faith Promise Giving and expanding the mission of this church. We also did work camps for a long period of time, mostly in Martinsburg, and I enjoyed participating with the youth and the adults during that. Played a lot of softball with the church team, and that was always a fun part of the year when we were in softball season. And we had a rich music program here. One of my best friends became the organist. Don Ising and his wife Marguerite played organ and piano, and we had a brass group that formed during that time, and we often had them accompanying the singing, especially on big occasions like Easter and Christmas. So those are some of the highlights. We have very many fond memories because our three sons spent a good bit of their years here growing up, and our oldest son graduated from Damascus High School, our middle son graduated from Baker Middle School, and our youngest son graduated from Damascus Elementary School the year that we moved to Faith Church in Rockville. So we have many very fond memories of being at Montgomery. Of the four churches I served in the 40 years of ministry, this was the church I served the longest, and certainly has a very important place in our lives, and excuse me, and just is a congregation that we deeply love. So it was a joy and a privilege to be the pastor here, and now that you're celebrating 175 years, to just celebrate that God continues to build and grow this congregation.
Hello, I'm John Rudisil, the current senior pastor here at Montgomery Church. Montgomery Church has always been known as a warm, caring place, a place of hospitality where you can feel comfortable from the moment you come in the door. We want to build on that in days to come. You know, ministry's changed quite a bit in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, when a United Methodist family moved to a new community, they'd automatically seek out the closest United Methodist church and establish with them that very Sunday. That doesn't happen quite as often in this day and age. In fact, there are a lot more other choices, other options on Sundays. 25 years ago in Calvert County, they built a new park on the adjacent property to a United Methodist church. And they made a rule that there would be no events scheduled on Sunday until after 1 o'clock so that they wouldn't interfere with the church. It's not quite the same these days, and you can't expect folks to automatically come in the door. So how can they know how caring and warm we are until they make it here? So we've made a conscious effort to try and make partnerships in the community, connections around our community. And we've leveraged sports as part of that. We're entering into a relationship with the YMCA of Frederick so that folks will come here for soccer, for pickleball, for other events, so that we can build relationships there that'll bear fruit in days to come. We're also building community relationships with other organizations. 2 years ago, right before the Super Bowl, we had a little competition between the Cowboy fans and the Redskin fans to see who could bring in more cans of chicken soup. We called it our Super Bowl of Caring. And amazingly, the Cowboy fans brought in more cans than the Redskins, and it's Redskins territory. That was one surprise. A second surprise was we got over 1,200 cans of soup in just 4 weeks. A third surprise was we ended up with 30 volunteers that are connecting with Blessings in a Backpack. Blessings in a Backpack is going to send home food for children who may not have any other source of food on the weekends. That's a really critical ministry. We also did a supermarket stakeout at our local supermarket where we asked folks to pick up just one extra item. They ran out of mac and cheese. They ran out of chicken soup. They ran out of all the other items that we asked people to pick up, and we were able to be such a blessing, but even more so. One of the ladies who came out said, "I used to be one of those children. I understand how important this is." Another fellow said, "I just came here to use the ATM, but I was so excited about what you're doing, I brought a whole bag for myself." So we ended up with many more things than we ever thought possible. And that's how we need to continue to connect with those in our community and with ourselves as well. One of our priorities currently is building small group ministry here that will allow folks time outside of Sunday morning to sit down in face-to-face connection and share their heart, to truly support each other and grow deeper in their faith together. And in those ways, we're hoping to just continue to build on the legacy of those wonderful people on whose shoulders we stand here at Montgomery Church.